The morning he realized I was gone, he called me 9 times before 7 a.m. I know that because my phone was sitting face up on the passenger seat of my car, and I watched every single call come in while I sat in the parking lot of a Starbucks 20 minutes from the house, both hands wrapped around a coffee I wasn't really drinking. The screen would light up, his name would appear, and I would just watch it until it stopped. Then I'd take a slow breath. Then it would start again. I didn't answer. I want to tell you what happened the night before, because that's where it really begins. Not with the phone calls, not with the parking lot. With him walking through our front door at 10:45 on a Tuesday night, smelling like someone else's perfume and carrying the kind of confidence that only belongs to a man who has never once been held accountable for anything. My name is Adrienne. I'm 31 years old. I work in corporate accounting, and for 3 years I was married to a man named Kevin, who believed deeply and without question that I needed him more than he needed me. He was wrong. But it took me a while to stop letting him be wrong out loud. We met at a work event, not the same company, just the same industry conference in Chicago. He was charming in that effortless way that feels like a compliment at first, and only later starts to feel like a performance. By the time I understood the difference, I had already moved across 2 states, left a job I loved, and merged my finances with his, under the assumption that we were building something together. That's the part no one tells you about certain kinds of relationships. The erosion is so gradual you don't notice it happening. 1 compromise becomes 2. 2 become 10. And somewhere along the way you stop recognizing the decisions you're making as decisions at all. They just become the shape of your life. I had a good salary. I always had. But Kevin made more, and he never let that fact rest quietly in the background the way it should have. It surfaced in small ways. Who made the final call on vacations, whose opinion carried more weight at dinner parties, whose career inconvenience mattered more when schedules conflicted. He wasn't cruel about it. He was just certain. And certainty, when it's wielded consistently enough, has a way of making the other person feel like the uncertain one. For most of our marriage, I handled everything he didn't want to think about: the insurance, the taxes, the investment accounts, the mortgage paperwork. He signed what I put in front of him and went back to whatever he was doing. He assumed I was managing our shared life. He never stopped to consider that I might also be managing mine. That Tuesday, I had sent him 2 texts by noon. Just simple things. Running late? Want me to pick up dinner? Normal. The kind of messages that don't mean anything on their own but start to feel heavy when they go unanswered for hours. By 7 p.m., I had stopped checking my phone. I made dinner for 1, ate at the kitchen counter, and watched the light outside change from gold to gray to dark. The neighborhood we lived in was quiet, one of those newer developments in the suburbs of Columbus where everything looks slightly too perfect, like a model home someone forgot to move out of. I had never loved it there, but Kevin had wanted the space, the garage, the yard we never used, and I had said okay because okay was what I said then. He got home at 10:45. I heard the garage door first, then the door from the garage into the kitchen. Then the particular sound of him not being careful. Keys dropped on the counter, shoes left in the middle of the floor, jacket thrown toward the hook and missing it. I was on the couch with a book I hadn't been reading for the past 2 hours. He walked in, looked at me, and smiled. Not warmly, not apologetically. There was something almost theatrical about it. Like he rehearsed the expression in the car on the way home. "Hey," he said. "Hey," I said. He went to the fridge, opened it, stared at it, closed it. Then he turned around and leaned against the counter with his arms crossed, watching me in a way that felt deliberate. Testing something. "I need to tell you something," he said. I set the book down. He didn't look nervous. That was the thing I kept coming back to later. He didn't look nervous at all. He looked like a man who had already decided how this conversation was going to go and was mildly curious to see if I would follow the script. "I've been seeing someone," he said. "Someone from the Henderson account. It's been a few months." The room didn't spin. There was no dramatic moment of the world falling away. It was more like something clicking into place, a sound so quiet and so final that you feel it more than hear it. I looked at him. He looked at me. "Okay," I said. That wasn't what he expected. I could tell because the expression shifted just slightly, something uncertain moving behind his eyes before the confidence reassembled itself. I'm not ending it, he continued, his voice still even. I think you should know that. I'm not going to lie to you about it. I nodded slowly the way you nod when someone tells you something you already half knew but weren't ready to name. Are you going to say something? He asked. Not tonight, I said. I picked the book back up, not because I was going to read it, just because my hands needed somewhere to be. He stood there for another minute waiting. Then he said, We'll figure this out. In a tone that suggested he had already figured it out and was simply informing me of the results. He went upstairs. I heard the shower run. Then the bedroom door close. I sat on the couch for a long time after that. Here's what Kevin didn't know. Sitting up there in the room we'd shared for 3 years, certain that I would absorb what he'd said and adapt to it the way I had adapted to everything else. He didn't know about the account I'd opened at a separate bank 11 months after we got married. After a conversation with my older sister that I had filed away and only half believed I'd ever need to act on. He didn't know I'd been contributing to it quietly ever since. Amounts small enough not to trigger questions. Amounts that had grown into something significant by now. He didn't know that the Roth IRA in my name, the one he'd signed paperwork acknowledging during our first tax filing, had been growing in a direction he had no visibility into. He didn't know that the down payment on the house, the one we'd bought 18 months into the marriage, had come almost entirely from a settlement I'd received before we met. Money I had documented carefully and kept legally separate on the advice of an attorney friend who had told me, gently, that it was wise to protect what was yours. He had signed the mortgage documents without reading them. He always signed things without reading them because reading things was my job. He thought my silence meant I was processing, that I was deciding whether to cry or confront or bargain. I wasn't processing, I was remembering. I went to the small room off the hallway around midnight, what we called the office, though Kevin used it mostly to store golf equipment he never touched. My laptop was there. I opened it and spent the next 3 hours doing what I had been, in some quiet part of my mind, preparing to do for longer than I wanted to admit. I checked the primary joint account first. Untouched. I wasn't going to move anything from there tonight, nothing that wasn't legally clean, nothing that would muddy the process later. I already knew what I was allowed to do and what I wasn't, because 6 weeks earlier, after a bad night that I won't get into here, I had called a family law attorney named Patricia Owens and had a consultation I told no one about. Patricia had been calm, precise, and completely unsentimental. She had explained Ohio's equitable distribution laws. She had told me what documentation I needed, what accounts were protected, what could be contested. She had told me to come back when I was ready. I opened an email and typed, Patricia, I'm ready. Can we meet this week? I'll bring everything. Then I moved through the files I'd been organizing for months without fully acknowledging that I was organizing them. Bank statements going back 2 years, investment account summaries, the original settlement documentation from before the marriage, clearly dated, clearly separate, mortgage records, a spreadsheet I'd built quietly over several months that tracked in plain numbers every meaningful financial decision made during our marriage, who had contributed what, whose name was on what was shared and what was mine. I printed nothing that night. I saved everything to a drive I kept in my work bag, a bag Kevin had never once looked inside, and I put the drive in my coat pocket. By 3 a.m., I had done everything I could do from that chair. I closed the laptop. I sat in the dark for a few minutes listening to the house. Somewhere upstairs, Kevin was asleep, probably on his side of the bed, probably completely unbothered, probably planning a conversation in the morning where he would explain, reasonably and with great patience, what our new arrangement would look like and why I should accept it. I went upstairs. I didn't get into bed. I stood in the doorway of our room for just a moment, looking at him the way you look at something you've finally decided to put down after carrying it too long. No anger. Just the particular clarity of a decision that has already been made. Then I went to the guest room and slept for 4 hours. I was up at 5:30. Kevin wouldn't be up until 7:30 at the earliest, probably later. I moved through the house quietly, deliberately. I made coffee. I drank half of it standing at the kitchen window watching the sky get lighter, that specific shade of pale gray that comes just before the sun commits. Then I went upstairs and packed a bag. Not everything, not dramatically, just what I needed for the next 2 weeks. Work clothes, personal documents, the things that were irreplaceably mine. I had done a version of this packing in my head a dozen times over the past months. So the actual physical act of it took less than 40 minutes. I moved without hesitation. I kept the sounds small. I put the bag in my car. Then I came back inside. On the kitchen table, I placed an envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Not a letter. Not an explanation. Just a printed note with Patricia's contact information and a short sentence that said all future communication should go through her office. I adjusted the envelope so it sat centered on the table, parallel to the edge. I looked at it for a second. Then I picked up my coffee, my coat, and my bag, and I walked out the front door. The air outside was cold in that sharp, specific way that only happens in Ohio in early November. The kind of cold that wakes you up faster than caffeine. I got into my car, backed out of the driveway, and drove away from the house on the quiet, perfect street, without looking in the rearview mirror. I cried a little on the highway. Not dramatically. Just the way your eyes water when the pressure behind them finally has somewhere to go. By the time I pulled into the Starbucks parking lot, it had passed. I ordered a coffee I didn't really need and sat with my phone and watched his name light up the screen 9 times. I didn't answer. Patricia's office was in a building downtown that smelled like recycled air and carpet cleaner in a way that should have felt cold but somehow felt steady. She greeted me with a handshake and a look that said she had seen this before and would handle it efficiently. I handed her the drive. She plugged it in, scanned the contents, and said nothing for a full minute. Then she looked up. "This is thorough," she said. "I wanted to be prepared." She nodded once. "The separate property documentation is solid. The prenuptial question doesn't apply here. Ohio doesn't require it for assets that are provably separate. The settlement funds, given the dating and documentation, should be protected." "What about the house?" She looked back at the screen. "The down payment origin strengthens your position considerably. He signed the mortgage documents as a co-borrower, which complicates full ownership. But the equitable distribution calculation, given what you've documented here, is going to favor you significantly." She looked at me directly. "Are you prepared for this to move?" "Yes," she closed the laptop. "Then let's move." Kevin called Patricia's office before 10 a.m. Her assistant fielded it. He was told, formally and without hostility, that all communication should proceed through legal channels, and that his wife had retained their office for the dissolution proceedings. I know what he said next, or something close to it, because he said a version of it in the text he sent me at 10:23 a.m. "You're doing this over one conversation? Over me being honest with you?" I read it in Patricia's conference room. I showed it to her. She read it, slid the phone back to me, and said, "Don't answer that." I wasn't going to. Here's what Kevin meant by honest. That he had told me the truth instead of hiding it, and that this should count for something. That telling the truth about a betrayal is a form of respect that entitles you to a measured response, a mature conversation, a negotiated new arrangement. What he had never considered was that honesty isn't something you get credit for when you use it as a weapon. He hadn't been honest with me. He had been strategic. He had looked at me sitting on that couch and calculated that announcing this to my face, confidently, without apology, would establish a power dynamic he could build the rest of our marriage around. He had read me completely wrong. The texts kept coming. By noon, he had sent 8. They moved through anger, then disbelief, then a kind of bargaining that made me feel tired in a way that had nothing to do with the 4 hours of sleep. "We can work through this. You're overreacting." I said I was honest with you. Most people don't get that. Call me back. This is insane. And then, around 2 p.m., the one that told me he'd spoken to someone who'd explained some of what was in that envelope. "The house is in both our names. You can't just decide that." I almost typed back. I didn't. What I would have said if I had answered, and I thought about this while Patricia walked me through the preliminary filings, was that his name on a document he signed without reading is still his name on a document, that signatures have consequences whether or not you understood what you were signing, that the person who paid attention to the details, who read every line, who kept every record, was always going to be in a better position than the person who assumed the details would manage themselves. I didn't type any of that. Patricia's assistant filed the papers. I signed my name where I needed to sign it, and the process began. I stayed with my sister in Dublin, a suburb north of Columbus, for the first 3 weeks. She didn't ask a lot of questions. She made soup more than once, kept the guest room quiet, and let me have the kind of space that doesn't feel like distance. I'm grateful for her in a way I find difficult to put words to. Kevin contacted his own attorney within 48 hours. There were motions and counter-motions, the kind of procedural back and forth that is standard and exhausting and ultimately uneventful when your documentation is as clean as mine was. He contested the characterization of the down payment. Patricia walked the other side through the paper trail in a single response letter. They didn't contest it again. The house was appraised. The accounts were reviewed. The settlement documentation held. The process, as Patricia had predicted, was straightforward, not fast. These things are never fast, but clean. Ordered. Every step had a name and a deadline, and I moved through them one by one, methodically, without drama. I went back to the house once, officially, with a moving company to collect the rest of my things. Kevin was not there. His attorney had arranged for that, and I was grateful for it. The house felt smaller than I remembered. Or maybe I felt bigger. I walked through the rooms one last time while the movers worked. Not for sentiment, just for closure, the kind that comes from actually being in a space and letting yourself feel that it's over. There was nothing left I wanted from it. We saw each other in person once, about 6 weeks after I left, in the parking lot of a neutral location, a midpoint between where he was staying and where I was. He had requested the meeting through his attorney to discuss a few personal items. I agreed, not because I expected anything useful to come from it, but because there was one thing I had decided I wanted to say. He looked tired, not destroyed. Kevin was not the kind of person who lets himself look destroyed in public, but tired in a way that sat around his eyes and in the slightly unfamiliar way he held his shoulders. He said I looked good. I said I would. He had a box of things for me. Books, a few kitchen things, photographs. He had packed them carefully. I appreciated that, quietly and without saying so. I didn't think you'd actually do it, he said. His voice was different from the texts, lower, less certain, more real. I know, I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I thought you needed me. I looked at him when he said that, directly, without any particular expression. I know that too, I said. That seemed to be the thing he least expected to hear. He frowned slightly, as if he was waiting for the hostility that never arrived, as if the absence of it was its own kind of answer. She didn't mean anything, he said. If that changes anything. It doesn't, I said. Not coldly, just clearly. He nodded slowly, something in his posture shifting. The last of the prepared things he had to say seemed to leave him all at once. What was left was just a person standing in a parking lot on a gray November morning, realizing that the story had ended differently than he'd written it. I handled it badly, he said. You did, I agreed. But that's not why I left. He looked up. I left because of who you had always been, I said. That night was just the first time you said it out loud. He didn't have an answer for that. I didn't need him to. I put the box in my car, said goodbye, and got back on the highway. The divorce was finalized in March. The house sold 6 months later, on a timeline that worked for me, at a price I was satisfied with. I moved into an apartment in the short north, a neighborhood in Columbus I'd always liked, but Kevin had found too small, too urban, too inconvenient for his commute. I have a good view of the street and a coffee shop I like 2 blocks away and more quiet than I've had in years. I am not going to tell you that everything got better immediately. That's not the truth. There were nights that were harder than I expected. Not because I missed Kevin specifically, but because I missed the version of my life I had believed I was building. That particular grief is real, and it takes time. And anyone who tells you it doesn't is either lying or hasn't sat still long enough to feel it. But there is also this. I wake up in the morning and every decision in front of me is mine. The apartment. The schedule. The money I earn and where it goes and what it builds. The quiet on a Sunday afternoon that belongs entirely to me. I spent a long time in a relationship where I made myself smaller to make someone else more comfortable. I told myself it was patience. I told myself it was compromise. What I didn't understand, and what I understand now, clearly and without bitterness, is that there is a difference between choosing to give something and slowly losing track of the fact that you're giving it at all. I stopped keeping track. That was on me. And when I started again, I found out that I had held on to far more than I realized. Heaven didn't take anything from me when he walked into that living room and said what he said. He didn't have the power to. The things that were mine, because I had been paying attention for years, even when I pretended, mostly to myself, that I wasn't. People sometimes talk about walking away like it's the hard part. And yes, the moment of it is hard, but the harder thing, the thing that actually required something from me, was the long, quiet work of knowing what I was worth before I ever needed to prove it. I didn't need to make noise to make a point. I didn't need to fight for what was already mine. I just needed to stop holding his world together long enough for him to feel the difference. And when I did, he felt it. If you've been reading this and something in it feels familiar, I'm not going to tell you what to do. You know your life better than I do. But I will tell you what I wish someone had told me earlier. The stillness you're using to keep the peace is not the same as peace. And the plans you've been quietly making in the back of your mind deserve to be taken seriously. You already know what you know. Trust that. I've thought a lot about what actually made Kevin believe he could walk into that living room and say what he said. Not the affair itself, that was its own failure. But the confidence behind the announcement, the way he stood there arms crossed, watching my face like he already knew what my reaction would be and had already decided it didn't matter. That kind of confidence doesn't come from nowhere. It gets built slowly over years by a person who keeps showing up and absorbing things that should not be absorbed. Every time I adjusted my tone so he wouldn't get irritated. Every time I signed off on his version of a decision because the argument wasn't worth the energy. Every time I handled something difficult and said nothing about it, because handling things quietly was just what I did. I taught him without meaning to that I would hold. That no matter what he did, I would continue to hold. What I didn't understand then, and what I understand now with the kind of clarity that only comes after you've sat on the other side of it, is that endurance without boundaries isn't strength. It looks like strength from the outside and it can feel like strength in the moment because it takes real effort to stay steady when things are hard. But there is a version of staying steady that is actually just postponing the truth. And the truth, when it finally surfaces, doesn't care how long you waited. Kevin made choices. That's the part that belongs entirely to him. But I also made choices. Quieter ones, slower ones. And those choices shaped the situation just as much as his did. The moment I stopped asking what I deserved and started just managing what I had, I handed over something I didn't know I was giving away. What I got back, and this is the part that still surprises me, was not the result of a fight. I didn't win anything in the dramatic sense of the word. I just stopped participating in an arrangement that had never actually been fair. And when I did, the consequences were immediate and they were real. And they belonged entirely to the choices each of us had made. That's how it works. Not as punishment, not as reward. Just as outcome. The woman who pays attention to her finances for 11 years straight does not end up without options. The man who signs documents without reading them does not end up with leverage. The person who plans carefully and documents thoroughly does not get blindsided by process. These aren't lucky accidents. They are the direct results of decisions made quietly, daily, over a long period of time. I think about Adrienne, about the version of me sitting in that office at midnight, opening files I had been building for months. And what strikes me most is not how prepared I was. It's how long I had been preparing without fully admitting to myself what I was preparing for. Some part of me always knew. I just needed one honest moment from him to stop pretending otherwise. The intelligence was there. The discipline was there. What took time was giving myself permission to use them in my own direction. If there is anything worth taking from this, it is that. Not a formula, not a plan, just the understanding that the capacity you've been quietly building, the competence, the patience, the careful attention to things that matter, does not disappear just because someone decided to treat it like it wasn't valuable. It stays, it waits, and when the moment finally comes where you need it, it is exactly where you left it. You don't have to be louder to be taken seriously. You just have to stop holding things together for people who would never notice if you let go.